Hello, this is October 31st, 2005, 1:30 p.m. Happy Halloween for all those of you who celebrate that. Um, okay, this video is going to be kind of where I get down to the subjects I really like discussing, prefer discussing. In fact, the stuff that probably one of my main contributions to the effort that I'm making, which is a sort of a chronicle of the human journey and the role that energy has played in it. That is a key aspect of my work. So I'll just start going through. So, when I became Dennis Lee's partner in January of '87, I had a very good idea of what the transformative potential of free energy would be for human societies. And in the nearly 40 years since then, I've just continually developed my understanding of all that. And I know that I can barely imagine what a world based on free energy can look like. The world will end as we know it. And so, and the primary upshot of that for me, well, there's a few. One is humanity will stop destroying Earth's ecosystems and environment, and will stop making Earth uninhabitable. And the other one is that the scarcity and fear, which have been humanity's constant companions, would vanish. Again, fear is always the feeling of not being controlled. What happens to your body, and it always in a world of scarcity, that's just fear is normal. And so, anyway, if there wasn't scarcity any longer, I think that, in fact, I think you'll see a new kind of human. Um, and when I got those visions when I became Dennis's partner, and then I got to live through a nightmare for the next few years of being wiped out by the global elite, basically. And and then as I did a video a few days ago around where does free energy come from? In 1990, I was introduced to the idea of zero point energy via a friend who visited an inventor who had the goods, had a device that produced 1.5 million times the energy that went into it. And that's the holy grail of the human journey. So, and that's, I've seen lots of work of fiction, movies, etc., where somebody has this great new energy source, and everything changes. Star Trek's kind of based on that, right? So, anyway, but once I started thinking in those terms, it still took another 20 years before I developed my concept of the epochs, what I call epochs of the human journey. And when I got radicalized in 1990, I began my days of study. And, I was studying science quite a bit, actually, but I really dove in on the science front around 2003. In fact, beginning to study Bucky Fuller's work, peak Oilers, and then I really resumed my science studies. And in popularized science is plenty to reach the understandings that I think the people I am seeking need to achieve for an effort like mine to succeed. Yeah, with the comprehensive perspective, you don't get lost in the weeds, and you don't hack at branches. You understand what the big leverage points are, what's really important, and why something like a free energy effort needs to be supported. It's the most important effort in the world is to support something like that. And I decided, and the approach I've been taking is one that I saw nobody taking, and I decided it was worth my life to try it out. So I have devoted my life to this. And in 2013-14, I wrote my lifetime's most ambitious essay called Energy in the Human Journey. And half of it, though, was concerned with the journey of life on Earth before humans arrived on the evolutionary scene. And quite frankly, that was the most fun part for me. That was really getting into, it's pure science, so studying the journey of life on Earth and the human journey before writing and history is the province of scientists. That's the only process we have to try to understand what happened so long ago. And my first love was paleontology, archaeology, back when I was a kid. I was collecting fossils when I was 8 years old. And then anyway, and during my studies, the energy issue is just so huge. Again, once you develop these perspectives and do the work, the energy issue just becomes so overwhelmingly evident. From the very beginnings of life on Earth, the enzymes speed up chemical reactions by up to billions of times. And without enzymes, life as we know it wouldn't exist. Cyanobacteria, 3 billion years ago or so, learned to evolve to split water to get its electrons for photosynthesis. And that actually was the oxygen we breathe comes from that. And the oxygenation of Earth's atmosphere actually saved Earth's ocean from being blasted into space, like it has with Mars, and Venus maybe never had any oceans. And so it really, in fact, studying our close neighbors in the solar system, they came up with the concept of the habitable zone, which we live in, where liquid water can exist, and again, but if it wasn't for cyanobacteria, we might have lost our water by now. And that would have meant life on Earth as we know it wouldn't exist. And then there was the development of complex cells, where archaean and a bacterium got together and they created complex cells. You had some like mitochondria and nuclei, these kinds of things. And then there was the evolution of using oxygen for respiration because there's all this available oxygen from the cyanobacteria. And oxygenic respiration is several times more energy productive than any other kind of respiration. And so life became a voracious consumer of energy. So all those innovations that life created, today, pound for pound, complex life burns energy 100,000 times as fast as the sun produces it. Bro, that's really an awesome number, and it shows how incredibly energy intensive life is. And so anyway, so this was all fun stuff to study. And but from its watery beginnings of life, however it came into being, and there's a number of hypotheses on that. I think I favor the alkaline events in the ocean floor, which Nick Lane has done a lot of work on. Maybe that's it. Maybe not. There's several different hypotheses, but that one, I like it, but who knows? But eventually, life began to migrate to land, which led to us. So when vertebrates migrated to land, that led to, the eon of complex life began in the oceans, but then didn't take all that long before some of these animals started migrating to land, and plants did also, which forms the basis of our ecosystems. Yeah, plants are still the vast majority of biomass on Earth. And then in the eon of complex life, you had, again, life was always looking at new ways to obtain energy, reproduce, and survive. And this continual thing. Biochemically, actually, eon of complex life hasn't been that interesting, let's say, to like a chemist, because all the chemical wizardry and stuff was microbes are the ones who perfected all of that. And so complex life is sort of like another layer on top of that, but the underlying chemistry basically hasn't changed. Aerobic respiration, again, cyanobacteria, which is the basis of, in fact, plants. Chloroplast is a cyanobacteria that entered into a partnership, and so mitochondria, is a bacteria that entered into a partnership. And so, and then during the eon of complex life, there are all these mass extinction events pretty regularly. And through my studies, they seem to all have been, to one degree or another, energy crises. And they're usually caused by volcanism, and sort of geophysical events. There was a bolide that wiped out the dinosaurs, but that was probably the only bolide big enough to have a mass extinction, create a mass extinction event. And in fact, when the dinosaurs eventually got wiped out by that bolide, these previously marginal mammals, the decks were cleared, and so mammals rose to prominence. And that's actually a really common outcome of mass extinctions, where previously marginal animals survive in the margins, and the animals that previously dominated went extinct. And so that's how they actually, the periods of the geological time scale is punctuated by the change in fossils, which showed what were the most prevalent, organisms. And so mass extinction events are always, they delineated each geological period. And anyway, so when dinosaurs were wiped out, and all of a sudden mammals came about, and flowering plants actually had evolved during the dinosaur days, and they dominate today everywhere. Like I live an ice age forest, rainforest of the Pacific Northwest. But anywhere south, all the temperate tropical regions of Earth, are dominated by flowering plants. And flowering plants enter into a symbiosis with animals. So animals reduce the reproductive costs of plants by doing the fertilization and spreading their seeds. And so this is a symbiosis. In fact, the greatest symbiosis of plant and animal ever was that. And anyway, then there was some mammals that migrated into the tropical canopies, fruit-rich tropical canopies, and they became primates. In fact, they developed opposable thumbs, to navigate the arboreal environment. And again, Earth's temperature has fluctuated. We have had ice ages and hot periods. And about 50 million years ago, a hot period ended, and it's been getting colder ever since. In fact, we've been in an ice age for the last 2.5 million years, and during that, the tropical canopy shrank because it's colder and drier, and some of these tree dwelling monkeys actually started migrating to the ground, became apes, and this is the story that leads to us. And so anyway, when apes, in fact, in my summary, I don't really mention this much, but it's another fascinating, so many fascinating chapters of this journey. Africa began colliding into Eurasia about 20 million years ago. And what happened was that in Africa, that's where the monkeys and apes, apes actually. So apes evolved in Africa, along with the elephant family. And in fact, what happened was when Africa and Eurasia collided, all the more cosmopolitan Eurasian species ended up dominating Africa. Except there were two big winners, which were apes and the elephant family. So the elephant family left Africa and dominated all biomes it could get to. In fact, before the rise of humans, the elephant family was the most successful mammal ever. Yeah, they lived everywhere they could get to. And apes also did well. In fact, when that collision happened, it was what's called the Miocene warming, which was actually caused by volcanism near where I live for a couple million years. Is now 17 million years ago, et cetera. And then what happened was these apes spread out across Eurasia, and many they think there were like maybe 100 ape species during the golden age of apes back then. And but that was kind of a blip, and after a couple million years, it started cooling down again, and eventually, apes were confined to Africa and its vicinity, and also Southeast Asia. So the orangutan, given that's the remnant of the migration that happened, long time ago. And so what happened was maybe in fact, to get to apes. So apes actually migrated from monkeys migrated from the tropical canopy 20, somewhere less than 30 million years ago as it kept getting colder. And then what happened was that 6 million years ago or something, some number like that, some apes learned to walk upright. And they had left the rainforest, and fact, sometimes I just think that pair bonding might have begun then because the canine teeth shrank, and big canines were male fighting tools for fighting for mating privileges. And so when pair bonding happened, it reduced the need to fight over mates. And that's scientists think that pair bonding and bipedal locomotion probably went hand in hand. But the other thing that happened with bipedal locomotion is their hands now were freed, and their hands were free to they are no longer um, always negotiate in an arboreal environment. So these hands became very handy. And about 3 million, over 3 million years ago, this is furthest we can find so far, like 3.3, 3.4 million years ago, some of these upright apes that are in East Africa, Australopiths, they call them. They invented the first crafted stone tools. And this was a watershed event in the history of life on Earth. And so those stone tools allowed for more caloric security, food. So they're better able to acquire food with these tools. And the stone tools are the ones that survive for scientists to observe and study, et cetera. But there were obviously many other kinds of tools that didn't survive, the artifactual record because they're made out of wood, plants, et cetera. Like chimps today will take a branch and strip the leaves off it and use it to fish termites out of nests. In fact, that was Jane Goodall that saw this, and it was chimps were actually making and using tools, which was this back in the 60 years ago, over 60 years ago, and that was a big deal when she discovered that. So anyway, it turns out that about the same time that stone tools were developed, that the whole line of Australopiths, et cetera, started having explosive brain growth. And it turns out that neurons are energy hogs. In fact, they're never at rest. They spend up to about half their energy maintaining this ready state so they can fire quickly. So you can, the dance of predator and prey, it requires quick action. And so the nervous system is a very energy intensive system. And when the brain started growing, in fact, between those first stone tools and when Homo erectus appeared on the scene 2.1 million years ago or something, the brain size doubled. And that's actually the most dramatic brain growth of any animal in the history of life on Earth. That was a super spectacular growth of brains, and it needed a lot of energy. So, in fact, our brains are like 2% of our body mass, but it consumes 20% of our metabolic energy. In fact, with infants, it's got half or something. It's a lot bigger with infants. So that brain, yeah. So our brains set us apart. Definitely, our big brains is what set big brains and ability to make and use tools. That's what the human journey has been all about, and it's always also been about getting more energy. This has been a constant over the human journey. And when Homo erectus appeared on the scene, it was something different. And Homo erectus was completely adapted for living on the ground. They were runners. In fact, that's the only mammal that's ever been bipedal is us. That human line became bipedal, and no other mammal is bipedal. And Homo erectus controlled fire. In fact, these are wonderfully controversial areas on how long ago they actually did. In fact, Richard Wrangham, who was actually a pupil of Goodall's, he's the leading advocate of an early control of fire. He thinks it may have happened 2 million years ago, maybe. There's actually a lot of physical evidence that 1.5 million years ago there was control of fire, and that would have been Homo erectus. And Homo erectus became an apex predator. In fact, also they think that Homo erectus probably has something like language. In fact, even today, they keep finding, and this is one constant of these scientific investigations, is that these evolutionary events and stuff almost always happen sooner than scientists think. They always find a fossil that keeps moving back the horizon for when these evolutionary achievements were made. And yeah, chimps today, they actually found, chimps do a lot of things. Again, like when Jane Goodall saw they use tools, well, they do stuff that's very language-like. which is again, they do things that is used to be thought that only humans can do, and great apes do these things where they actually are innovative and again, very much like language. In fact, great apes readily learn sign language, and so anyway, Homo erectus became an apex predator there in Africa and soon spread out into Eurasia. And in fact, when they began their rise, suddenly there was a mid-Pleistocene extinction. And in Africa, there was all these big animals. The elephant family they took the brunt of it. And there were a lot of animal species, elephant species that were twice as big as African elephants today. And those quickly went extinct with the rise of Homo erectus and humans, etc. In fact, everywhere that the human line got to, the elephants quickly went extinct. Most of them did. In fact, what we see today is just a remnant of what used to be, again, global dominance. Elephants were globally dominant up until 1.5 million years ago. And what language did was it allowed to, in fact, so not only did intelligence increase with the growing brains, which is, there's lots of definitions of it, but I'm going to say it's problem solving. So the way that problem solving became, again, humans became expert at problem solving, particularly with their ability to make and use tools. And so what also happened was with language, et cetera, and social learning, even chimps, social learning. A mother will teach her infant, but mostly by observation, how to learn the skills they need to live. And so, but once language, et cetera, happened, then scientists think that it created a kind of a big ratchet effect. And so the collective intelligence of a society increased. Innovations didn't die with the innovator. It got transmitted and shared and eventually kept building and building. And you have this big ratchet effect. In fact, that's a big reason they think that humans became as dominant as we are. I'm going to put this on pause for just a second. So yeah, so humans became very successful, and very dominant. And social animals are social because sociality increases the survival and reproductive prospects of its members. Again, evolution. So it's like, that's how a species survive. Again, social animals. I mean, that's the key. Sociality is the key to their survival. But in societies, in fact, particularly vertebrate societies, particularly in land, so mammals, etc., social species, they're always jockeying for position, for ranking. They always are, because the benefits that come with that, mating privileges, safer sleeping places, more access to resources, water and food, these kinds of things. And there's a delicate dance of vying for rank, but also keeping the society cohesive. And in simian societies, it's a constant dance. They're always jockeying for position. All the gorillas, chimps, bonobos, I mean, they're constantly jockeying for status and position. And they do it, chimpanzees actually are very politically astute. In fact, Franz de Waal, who spent his career studying them, he basically said a human wouldn't last a day in a chimpanzee political system. They wouldn't be able to navigate it. Yeah, everything chimps do was political. And very, very savvy, politically savvy. And but anyway, the thing is that if there's too much of this, jockeying and it destroys the cohesion of society, it will quickly fall prey to its neighboring society. And chimps is this way. And so there's this constant jockeying that chimps do. And so for me, in over my years of studying all this, again, as a comprehensivist and generalist, you're always trying to boil it down. It's a scientist do. What are the main variables that are driving all this? And I've come down with three. It's energy, intelligence, and tools. And that's the human journey is revolved around energy, intelligence, and tools. And all the permutations of that, the interplay of those three, along with evolution, particularly in the appearance of humans on the evolutionary scene. And again, the artifactual record, going again, beginning over 3 million years ago to beginning of history, so 5,000 years ago, whatever. Um, the artifacts show that tools continually got more sophisticated. Um, and the human, line, again, evolution, the brains kept getting bigger, the tools kept getting more sophisticated. And about 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared on the evolutionary scene. They're in African vicinity. And so, Africa, there's all these big battles over, is Africa really the cradle of humanity? And I would say African vicinity is. And so the Eurasian, margins of Africa, there appears to have been a fair amount of evolution that is pertinent to the human journey that's happened around the perimeter of Europe, of Africa and Europe and Asia. Um, and when humans appeared, 300,000 years ago now is I think the earliest fossils that they said they found, but they really didn't have the early fossils. Their skulls were more so-called primitive than ours. They didn't have the globular shape that our skulls have, and their brains may have been well, yeah, brains may have been nearly as big, even bigger. In fact, Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. Um, but they were structured a little differently. They weren't as big in this area. And so they think that this area of our brains for neocortex and et cetera. Again, it's the whole science, fledgling science, in my opinion, but on studying the human brains in general. And that change in the shape of our skulls probably coincided, in fact, it was related, I'm sure, to the increasing, let's say, intelligence of humanity. And sometime 100,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, 70,000, somewhere in there, Homo sapiens achieved what we call behavioral modernity, which is basically you take a human being born that was behaviorally modern 60,000 years ago, whatever, and you stick them in a society today, they'll do fine. You take an infant from there and they would raise them as a human, and they'd be just fine. In fact, even Neanderthals, they call it the subway test or something. So basically, Neanderthal, you dress them up, they could have gotten on a subway and they wouldn't have elicited a lot of comment. Homo erectus. In fact, Homo erectus, 2 years ago, probably could have walked down the street with some minor facial prosthetics, etc., and passed for one of us. So yeah, evolution really hasn't. There's been up until Homo erectus, there was a lot of evolution going on in the previous several million years, and since then it's been more modest. And in fact, here humans, basically they say that human evolution is no longer that relevant, even though it still happens. But cultural evolution is much more, again, back to intelligence and tools and energy. Once behaviorally modern humans appeared on the scene, then evolution kind of took a back seat, and it was more about cultural evolution, increasing sophistication of tools, increasing capture of energy, this kind of thing. And anyway, in this period between the first stone tools, 3 some million years ago, to behaviorally modern humans, 60,000, 70,000, 100,000 years ago, somewhere in there. And I think scientists think it was more like 60,000, 70,000, something like that. I call that the first epoch of the human journey, which was becoming human. So becoming us, and this was my line of demarcation is when stone tools were first made. Again, this is my invention, so Others could, say, oh, well, when apes became bipedal, that was the beginning of the first epoch. And you know what? I suppose you could make a case for that. And so, but for me, the brain started galloping in its brain growth once those stone tools were made. And for me, that's again to me back to energy, intelligence, and tools. So when we started really mastering tools, which nothing on Earth ever did that before, um, that was really the beginning of the human journey. In my opinion, it's arguable, but this is what I've come up with. Um, and chimps and bonobos. In fact, bonobos are chimps that got isolated south of the Congo River maybe 2 million years ago. It's over 1 million years ago, maybe 2 million years ago. And when they got isolated, there weren't any gorillas there. And so, and where chimps and gorillas coexist, gorillas eat about, gorillas live in the heart of the rainforest and they eat more leafy matter, etc. Anyway, they're competitors for forage. And so when these bonobos found themselves isolated south of the Congo, not only from other chimp species, but from gorillas, they were able to have larger foraging parties and in fact females then. So females became permanent members of the foraging parties. Very socially, the social organization was far different than what chimps did. So chimps would have these fission fusion societies where they'd go out and try to find fruit trees and get their fruit, and then they'd meet back together again because one fruit tree couldn't feed a band of 50 chimps. And so it'd be foraging parties with a few chimps, even solitary chimps. And bonobos, in fact, what happened was when it was solitary chimps, etc., they became vulnerable to their neighbors doing raids on them and killing them. And this is stuff that Jane Goodall also discovered in her work was, again, chimps have warfare. They genocide, they slaughter each other, etc., over territory and mates. So yeah, a male chimp life's all about mating and eating, protecting their territory, and they will happily kill their neighboring societies in order to take their territory over, take their females, fertile females, and they'll kill the infants. And this is something, and this is certainly not unique to chimps. This is also territorial animals, social animals. This isn't new. And so in fact, one of Goodall's pupils was Richard Wrangham, who I mentioned about the early control of fire, and he also is the guy who's the leading advocate of the early warfare. It goes back, he says it goes back to chimps. Chimps form these coalitions to go into a neighboring territory and kill basically the males. And once they kill all the males off, then they'll take the territory and take the women, take the females, etc. Turns out that hunter-gatherers, what we know of hunter-gatherer societies in the past, they operate the same way. Literally, it's like they were like chimps with better tools, and so yeah, so there's a lot of humanity that could be seen in the journey of chimps, and so again, they're very close. In fact, when Goodall reported her findings that chimps may use tools to Leakey, her mentor, um, Leakey said, well, we're either going to have to redefine tool or redefine humans or consider chimps to be humans. And so, anyway, fascinating. It's all fast to me, fascinating areas of studying. And Jane Goodall was a pioneer of this stuff. R.I.P. Jane. So, anyway, but they found that chimps, again, this is back to Wrangham also. He studied this, where chimps are hundreds of times more aggressive and violent than the most violent human societies are. Violence is just a fact of life. And in fact, and I've studied warfare too much, but Azar Gat, who's an Israeli scholar, he stated as succinctly as I've seen, which is the biological compulsion to survive and reproduce in a world of scarcity is the root of all violence. And I will buy that. And in fact, bonobos are a great example of this. So what happened was for bonobos, when they find themselves isolated and they're able to form bigger foraging parties, the females banded together and overthrew male dominance. So males do not dominate bonobo societies. They'd like to, but the females make sure they don't. And so what happens is that bonobo societies are uniquely peaceful among the great apes. In fact, scientists, they think they maybe found one time that a bonobo suffered a violent death at the hand of its, fellow bonobos. I think it was maybe even a male, and a female's killed him. But anyway, so it's a thing where, but maybe once. But chimps, it's so there's a recent study, and they documented far more than 100 chimp murders, and they maybe found one bonobo murder, maybe. And in fact, infanticide, which is many, dozens of primate species do it. Many kind of mammals do this. It's called they kill in infants. Kind of their rivals. If particularly if they didn't father them. And anyway, bonobo societies, particularly with females kind of running the show, their scientists have yet to see an instance of infanticide with bonobos. And so they're peaceful. In fact, what happened is they use sex for everything. So it's like life's one big orgy for bonobos. The only people that don't, the only bonobos that don't get it on are mothers and sons bonobos. So they get that part. So yeah, the incest taboo is ancient, and again, it's there's evolutionary reasons for that because inbreeding like that causes genetic diseases, genetic problems. So they know it, So they refrain from that. Um, and so for me, the comparison of bonobos and chimps basically relative abundance and not. I mean, they became a different species. Their whole social organization is radically different than chimp species. And so, and then Wrangham made this case, and Wrangham said this is a very good, it's instructive to understand that, the bloody human journey did not have to be that way. I mean, well, that's another story. Did it have to or not? But basically, they're showing those our closest cousins that survived the rise of humans. Um, they don't live that way. And so it's anyway. Wrangham thinks that, and again, I agree. That's a big lesson for humanity. That here's these apes have found a way to live in peace because they live in relative plenty. Although, of course, they're threatened today with extinction by humans. But for 2 million years, or at least a million, vulnerable life was pretty good. Um, so yeah, so that was relative energetic abundance, which allowed that. Again, an abundant food supply that was not enjoyed by other chimp societies. And so, anyway, when humans became behaviorally modern, again, let's say 60,000 years ago, what happened was there was that can call the founder group. In fact, they think there was a genetic bottleneck in humanity maybe 70,000 years ago, when humans almost went extinct themselves. I got my doubts almost went extinct, but maybe. I mean, anyway, they think that maybe there were only several thousand humans, Homo sapiens, behaviorally modern, 70,000, 60,000 years ago. But those people conquered Earth. So they expanded from Africa, and eventually all inhabitable continents were inhabited by humans. It was about a 50,000 year process. And when it was over, humans dominated Earth. In fact, all other human species went extinct, and that was no coincidence. So yeah, so our ancestors drove them all to extinction one way or another. Some scientists like to think it was some peaceful interbreeding, etc. I doubt it. I mean, I'm sure that did happen, but come on, the human journey is very bloody, very violent. And in fact, that's another. I didn't get into it in this one, but in my book preview and my biggest essays I've written recently, the last decade or so is, you know, humans, yeah, it's a very violent past that we've had, and I think we need to face up to that. But again, back to scarcity. So I get it. This was in a world of scarcity and trying to survive. Violence is one way to meet your goals. And yeah, so God said that like social, we can cooperate, compete, or get violent. And so in fact, as I'll get by the end of this, I want to see a world where it's all cooperation. We don't need to compete. We don't need to get violent. And that's all born of scarcity. In a world of abundance, we don't need to do that anymore. Um, so not only did all other human species go extinct, but also all of Earth's easy meat went extinct. In fact, I've seen the numbers. Scientists think that humans, during this conquest of Earth, this 50,000 year conquest, humans killed 1 billion large animals. An awesome number. And in fact, the tail end of it, the very end of the conquest of Earth process, if exclude some islands out there in the oceans, was the Americas. And, the first humans got here, where I live, maybe 15,000 years ago, coming by the coast, maybe 13,000 years ago, coming through the interior overland, something like that. Well, anyway, what happened? One of the chief consequences was and there were no humans to displace, human species to displace when that happened. But there was all this easy meat, and so there were five genera of the elephant family, two in South America and three in North America. North America had the Columbian mammoth, the American mastodon, and the iconic woolly mammoth. And in only a few thousand years, the elephant family was completely driven to extinction in the Americas. And unfortunately, there's, I'm not going to rant on this, but there's all these so-called scientists that have been trying to absolve humanity of this, that, oh, humans didn't really do all that. It was climate change or some bulllight or whatever. And I think that really doesn't do service, to understanding the human journey and understanding actually how far we have come, and so, conservation mindedness, et cetera, that's pretty new in the human journey. When people are trying to survive, they're not concerned about conservation so much, right? And so, anyway, I can put this on pause for just a second. Okay. So, anyway, so humans populated Earth, and I call it the second epoch, the conquest of Earth. And by the end of the second epoch, there were 1,000 times as many people as there were at the beginning of the second epoch. Yeah, it went from several thousand to several million people. And again, then what happened was there was a golden age of the hunter gatherer. In fact, particularly Australia and the Americas, when the first humans came, and there was all this easy meat. And no fear of humans. You just walk up to them and spear them, etc. And yeah, they didn't last long. And so life was easy for humans during those early days, but before long, they burned through the megafauna, and then it was back to territoriality and slaughtering your neighbors, etc. And yeah, in fact, Australia stayed in the second epoch. And so this is something that is, again, very instructive. That Australia, when Britain invaded it back in the 1700s, Australia was pretty much a continent of hunter-gatherers. It never went to agriculture. In fact, that's another story I won't get into here on why that happened. But uh, one of my anthropologists that I really like reading his work, he thinks that because they couldn't drive the kangaroo to extinction, that big game hunting never declined. And so his farming never took hold. In fact, his argument was that agriculture wouldn't have happened where there was guys hunting megafauna, because the tools for hunting megafauna also are great for killing people. And so early farmers experimenting with, crops would have been easy prey, to raiders, hungry hunters coming and taking all their food. And so, anyway, and he says the archaeological evidence supports the idea that all the early civilizations, or the domestication revolution, early civilizations, they all rose peacefully, relatively. It wasn't until after that that it became war again. So there was this brief interlude in the violent human journey when life was pretty peaceful. Um, Yeah, so anyway, so elephant family made it to North America more than 16 million years ago. So yeah, they were where I live today. There are elephants here, and not anymore. So anyway, so yeah, so for me, now this is a subject I've studied actually quite a bit, and it's like, in fact, they're finally admitting it. It's the all these scientists trying to come up with this, humans didn't slaughter all the megafauna. It's now admitted that no, humans slaughtered all the megafauna. In fact, also related to this was uh, these scientists and anthropologists try to say, oh, how peaceful humans were in the past. And no, they weren't. In fact, the only ones that were kind of peaceful was early horticultural societies were women, because women probably invented domestic farming because it was an adjunct to their gathering duties. Because men hunted, men are twice as strong in their upper body as women. So they're much more capable of going and hunting megafauna than women were, even with projectile weapons. In fact, in these woke days, there's these so-called scientists trying to make the case that, oh, women were just as, just like men, like Amazons or whatever. And it's like, no, they weren't, and there were projectile weapons that made them a little better. And some women were able to do some of that, but not many, so most women were doing gathering. In fact, that's why their fingers are so nimble, much more nimbler than somebody's like mine, because evolution, man. Yeah, women have very nimble fingers and much more nimble than men's are. Men have these big muscle groups we're better at. That's all this evolution to adapt, to what we do. And so about 12,000 years ago, so the ice sheet. So we've been in an ice age for 2.5 million years. In fact, coincided with, again, the whole human journey has been, Homo erectus 2.1. So all of the human journey has really been during an ice age, and the ice age would expand and retreat. And the last million years has been like clockwork. Every 100,000 years, you get the ice sheets growing and receding. And about 12,000 years ago, we finally reached this interglacial level today that we live in. It's called the long summer. And yeah, we live in this unusual time, but between the ice sheets advancing and receding. And in fact, we burn so much fossil fuel that and we increase the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere so much that scientists are now thinking keep pushing back the window of when the ice sheets are going to return. In fact, maybe we'll have ended this ice age, and we'll see. But it's a thing where we've got definitely, it's had an impact with all the denials from oil company scientists aside, like Fred Singer. Um, we've definitely impacted the environment a lot. And again, wiping out all of our fellow human species and wiping out Earth's easy meat was sort of like our first achievement on that scale. And then farming. In fact, today the plant biomass has declined by half since the beginning of agriculture. And again, humans, so we want, in fact, 96% of the mammal biomass on Earth is humans and the domesticated animals. Wild animals are almost extinct. This is humanity. In fact, I hope to end all that again when we live in what I call the fifth epoch, and when this world of abundance, we don't dominate and exploit ecosystems any longer to live a good life. That's the technology's here for this. This is the crazy part of my journey. So anyway, the again, so 12,000 years ago, when the ice sheets had finally receded again, in northern hemisphere particularly, um, and again, it gets wetter and warmer when that happens. So yeah, when it's warmer, it gets wetter because there's more evaporation from the ocean. And so it gets warmer and wetter, and then the carbon dioxide level would go up. And the main reason is because the colder water absorbs more gas. And so when the ocean started heating up, again, Milankovitch cycles is why it cycles like this, which is wobbles in Earth's orientation towards the sun, basically because of the influence of our neighboring planets. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so the carbon dioxide, so the oceans they can't absorb as much carbon dioxide, and so when the interglacial the interval would happen, the oceans get warmer, it would release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, so the carbon dioxide level will increase. Not a lot, but it, go to 200 and some parts per million. We're double that right now, but anyway. And then what happened is a higher carbon dioxide level meant it was easier for plants to grow. And in fact, and I could go on and on and on for days on a lot of this stuff. But one of the pieces of evidence for declining carbon dioxide levels over the last 50 million years of cooling is that about 25 million years ago, or 30 million or so, some plants develop a new form of photosynthesis that conserve carbon and water. It's called C4. And in fact, today, most C4 plants are grasses, and so grasslands are pretty new in the history of life on Earth. And they basically replaced forests because it became too dry, and colder, drier world led to the expansion of grasslands and a shrinking of the forest. And again, back to the chimps that left the canopy, or the monkeys that left the canopy became apes, etc. So this cooling process has been going on for 50 million years, has been a big driver of evolution. And one of them was plants learned how to, some plants learn how to conserve their carbon as they're doing photosynthesis and conserve water. So anyway, the warming of Earth, higher carbon dioxide levels, 1,000 times as many people. Again, the extinction of most of the easy meat. These were all factors that scientists think was what led humans to start domesticating crops and plants. And so it's like, how are we going to eat now? And so this is the Malthusian process. In fact, Malthus, who influenced people like Darwin, et cetera, Malthus, I think he was right. He said that the human journey was one where humans would, again, he did this before there was a science of energy, but what he said is that when humans would all of a sudden get more food, all they would do is reproduce and there'd be more people. And so there'd be this brief golden period where all of a sudden life's easy and the food's plentiful, but people would breed up to the limits of the food supply. Then it'd be back to on the ragged edge of survival. And so warfare and famine and epidemics would reduce the populations and bring it back in balance with the carrying capacity of the land. And this is called the Malthusian process, which means that humans would always live on the brink of misery and survival because we just keep breeding to the limits of the energy supplies. And so, but what happened is, and we'll see how brief this little interval is, but 3 centuries ago, England industrialized off the power of coal. So it's a new energy source, fossil fuels, and they exploited like nobody ever had. And here we are. The industrial world came from exploiting fossil fuels, which will mostly run out in this century. And that's another story. But let me get back to the third epoch. So what happened is that people started raising crops. In fact, they also started domesticating animals, particularly in the Fertile Crescent. In the Americas, most of the candidates for domestication were wiped out during that migration to the Americas. And so, and funny thing is that horses and camels actually evolved in North America, and they were driven to extinction in North America, but they had also migrated across, because from the land bridge between North America and Asia, on that land bridge, there was a lot of cross migrations, and over the eons, horses and camels, some of them migrated to Asia. In fact, some to Africa, like the zebra in Africa, right? So that's actually ultimately evolved in North America. And so, but in North America, yeah, all the candidates for domestication have been rendered extinct. Almost all of them. The llama is the only draft animal that survived. And even then, it was nothing like horses and this kind of thing. And so, anyway, but so there were several places on Earth, I think independently, that people started domesticating plants and animals when they could, and this is what led to I call the third epoch. So the third epoch is, in fact, it's been called the domestication revolution. Good term. I call it the third epoch of the human journey. Again, based on the energy practices. So yeah, the second epoch was based on all the megafauna, which lived on all these continents that were fueled the expansion of humanity in the second epoch. And then what I call a third epoch has been fueled by crops and forests. In fact, in the Fertile Crescent, they call the Fertile Crescent, which is over there in today's Middle East, um, used to be all forested, and so yeah, the forest to farm to desert dynamic has been very evident in what happened there in what's today's Middle East. In fact, God, you go, Iraq, today's Iraq, which is I've put on pause for a second again. So Iraq, that was the cradle of civilization in Sumer, several thousand years ago. And again, it's rising. In fact, I get into this where, I study too much of this actually, where as soon as civilizations appeared, and civilizations appeared about 5,000 years after farming began in these areas of the world. In fact, there were four places where it independently arose: China, Fertile Crescent, today's Mexico, and down there in South America. And all those kind of independently civilization arose. And again, it's a problem-solving device. And that's another, I'm not going to get into it today, but there's a lot of very interesting theories about why civilization rose. But again, there's also, why farming rose. And so I gave the basic factors of why people think, scientists think that domestication became a step. In fact, they think there's some evidence of domestication in Australia, some in the Murray River area, which is southeastern Australia, which is kind of the, you know, place that looks most like, England, merry old England. That, like movies like Babe, etc., all staged in that part of Australia where you can pass for, a farm in Ohio. And so, anyway, domestication was this huge, another watershed moment of the human journey when people started raising crops. And it began in these centers. In fact, the biggest ones were those four civilizations arose. They were all based on farming, in fact, seed crops. And so that was basically seed crops is what they were based on. And that's not our natural diet either. So, chimps don't eat much in the way of seeds. And so this is something where we've definitely altered. Again, there's been costs of altering our diets to eating stuff that really wasn't our natural heritage. In fact, fruits and vegetables is what we're most suited to be eating, which goes back to leaves and fruit that the chimps and gorillas eat. So when agriculture began, again, women were the ones who, again, probably invented it. Maybe in all instances, we'll see. But again, it was just a natural because they were the natural gatherers. And so, anyways, in some societies, the women brought in so much of the economic, the calories. So women brought in way more calories than the men did. Meat was always prized. But when women were bringing in the vast majority of the calories of a society, a fair number of those societies became what's called matrilocal, which was the females stayed in their natal society and the males left, the inbreeding thing, the males left to breed. And that's a first going back, I don't know how many millions of years. So gorillas are mostly patrilocal. There's a little bit of more variation on that, but chimps are almost all patrilocal. And humans probably were patrilocal all the way until these horticultural societies. And there's some dispute on that, but I don't think the evidence is really great that there were these, women, matrilocal societies millions of years ago. But the ones that happened with early horticulture, when that happened, what happens is it broke up the male gangs that were usually ruling the rulers of their societies. In fact, it's been called fraternal interest groups. And so when these fraternal interest groups were broken up and women had this place of prominence, those were the most peaceful pre-industrial societies of the human journey. Yeah, so men weren't slaughtering each other to become the head man of their tribe, etc. It was a very different dynamic. And so in fact, and we had windows to that when Europe finally invaded North America, the eastern woodlands were mostly matrilocal societies. And there were much, in fact, an epidemic problem of the invading English was going native. They came to the eastern woodlands and they saw these major local societies and they thought they were superior to what they just came from in Europe. So there was all these runaways that would go run and live with the Indians. And in fact, the English considered that a capital crime to go and live with the Indians. I get ahead of myself here a little bit. But anyway, so then the agriculture was this incredible invention that enabled the energy supply, the caloric supply of humans to increase by another couple orders of magnitude. And so again, when humans left Africa to begin the second epoch, there were maybe 5,000, 10,000, 5,000, somewhere in there. And then when agriculture began, there were 5 or 10 million of people. And then when industrialization happened, there were like, a billion people, and that was another, 100 times as many people. And so, yeah, you could get 100 times as much energy out of the land by raising crops than you would in a hunter-gatherer regime. And so farming was a winner. In fact, it was an early honeymoon. In fact, there were intact forests, intact soils. There weren't pests yet. And so, yeah, early farming was probably pretty good. It expanded. We call it the Neolithic expansion. There was an expansion of farming from the places where it was invented. And again, relatively peaceful. The hunter-gatherers, though, people who had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, they were in trouble. And so wherever farming expanded, the hunter-gatherers either they took up farming or went extinct, or they end up living on like mountainsides and stuff where wasn't suitable for crops. And so this is what happened. In fact, the hunter-gatherer men pretty much went extinct. DNA studies have validated this. For hunter-gatherer men, pretty much went extinct. The hunter-gatherer women would mate with the rich farmers, and stuff. And anyways, there was probably 1,000 years or more of this honeymoon, where there's it's easy, relatively easy living, where the forests were intact, the soils were intact. And life was easy, life was good, and so it really expanded. But again, back to Malthus, so they bred up to the carrying capacity of the land, then they got territorial again and brutal, and this was, and in fact, back to the how ancient war is. There was again this faction of anthropologists. These factions said, "Oh, there wasn't any war until domestication revolution, or the rise of civilization." And I've looked into this quite a bit. I don't think so. I think that warfare goes back to chimps at least. The ants have wars, and so anyway, I think warfare is ancient, and it didn't new, but it took on new forms, and it was more people, so the wars were bigger, etc. But there was a honeymoon of agriculture, and then what happened was that when populations expanded, and then what you had men then, because in hunter-gatherer bands they couldn't afford to have a big man, so the male chimp proclivity would be the alpha. Hunter-gatherers couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford alphas. So men were actually, they kept cutting them down to size to keep them humble, et cetera, so they didn't try to take over their band. In fact, men who wouldn't play ball, they'd kill them. And in fact, Chris Bohm thinks that psychopathic genes were culled from the human genome during those days. But how to say it? I think we've seen the rise of the psychopaths again in many ways. But there was a time when, men trying to become the alphas wouldn't work. But once you started having agriculture and agricultural surplus, men rose to prominence violently and took it over. And in fact, it stopped being matrilocal. It started becoming male-dominated societies once again. And that's called progress. So anyway, as soon as in civilizations, so they're all, they think there were maybe 9 centers where agriculture was developed, but they didn't develop in the civilizations. There were only 4 different independent. They can only find 4 different times when civilization arose independently from a farming base, and again the 4 that I mentioned, and the ones that didn't, like in Highland New Guinea, it's like they didn't do that. And so there's these reasons. Again, it's logistical, et cetera, of why They did. In fact, all the earliest civilizations were situated on low energy transportation, like bodies of water. And so the hinterland could feed the cities off again with low energy transportation. In fact, overland transport was 100 times as expensive energetically as over water. And that's why all over civilization to this day, and most big cities and stuff are on bodies of water. And so because it was easy to supply them with low energy transportation lanes of water. And so anyway, but as soon as civilizations rose, okay, and then you had there are a few new social classes, but the two main ones are professions and elites. And they didn't really exist before the rise of civilization. In fact, slavery, which was really fact, back to hunter gatherers. I mean, one of the chimps did this. Hunter gatherers did the same thing. So the favorite form of hunter gatherer warfare was the surprise night raid on your neighboring society, and you'd slaughter them while they slept and take their women. And this was, and again, back to scientists think this was a way to keep the population within the carrying capacity of the land. And that's a hell of a way to do it. But scientists think that was the ultimate evolutionary, outcome here was it kept the populations within the carrying capacity as they slaughtered each other and took their women, etc. In fact, it's kind of funny. They found that in societies that were super dependent on hunting, like in the Arctic societies. Infanticide is something that it was common until industrialization. In fact, in my circles, there are people who they lost their siblings to infanticide. In peasant societies, it was normal, and in fact, in these Arctic societies, it got to the ratio. The ratio was 2 boys to 1 girl because they would just kill off the girls because men were so prized for their hunting prowess. And so what they found was that these societies that would be like this, well, they'd have a shortage of women. And so how do they remedy that? They invade their neighbors, slaughter the men, and take the women. And so on a macro basis, it brought the sexual ratios back into balance. That's a heck of a way to do it. So anyway, this is oh, the human journey. Yeah, and again, the good news is that we don't do that stuff anymore. But it used to be really normal, typical behavior with humans. And again, it's economics, man, energy. This is what it's all about. And so anyway, and then societies. So when civilizations arose, you had these elites who were basically parasites. There were these societal parasites who violently appropriated the surplus energy and commandeered it and became the rulers, and they all had this game of that they were either they were divine beings or had divine sanction or something. They always invoked God, whatever their God was to justify their positions. And this was again, it's a human universal. And in fact, when Spain invaded the Western Hemisphere and they saw all these societies that were very recognizable. In fact, when they eventually stumbled upon the Aztec society and destroyed it, but when they did, it was very similar to what you saw in the old world, markets and priests and slaves and all this kind of stuff, So it was again, to me, this was behaviorally modern humans stuck in Earth, at an agricultural level. Well, actually, again, the ones that came over were hunter-gatherers, and so it seems like, in fact, I'll call it conversion evolution of society. So you behaviorally modern human in these biomes on Earth, they would find a way to adapt to it, and one of the paths was domestication and then civilization. And the first civilizations all tried to conquer each other. This is yeah. So not only elites came to rise to primacy, etc. Again, violently, usually. I mean, always violently. And then they try to, form a religion around them so the people would worship them, etc. They all did this kind of stuff. And then what happened was they always try to conquer their neighbors so they could get more plunder, more women and more territory and more resources, etc. And they all did that. And I've studied. The last couple of years, I got into this, and I've studied probably 20 imperial trajectories, and particularly in the old world, the old Fertile Crescent. What's the one? Town. Babylon. So Babylon like rose and fell like three times, based on which empire was sort of running it, et cetera. And it's all in desert ruins today. In fact, so much that all the early civilizations collapsed because they were not energetically sustainable. Yeah, so they all deforested the hinterland and ruined the soils, et cetera, and bred to the carrying capacity. And then usually a drought did them in. In fact, all that deforestation and stuff contributed to the droughts, and so they basically, these civilizations cut out their legs from under them with their practices. In fact, in the Fertile Crescent today, it's all desert. The Tigris and Euphrates, they're still there. And if you look at, and I do this in my essays, you look at satellite photos of these areas, and there's these green stripes where the rivers are, and everything else is desert. And that was all forested. 10,000 years ago, that stuff was all forested and it's all gone. And in fact, where I live, because we have fossil fuels, etc., that's the only reason this hasn't been totally deforested. Because once you started exploiting coal and oil and gas, then you didn't need to, chop all the trees down for your fuel any longer. And so I get the benefit of that. Anyway, so yeah, so professions was a way that humans were relieved from subsistence duties. And so our big brains and our ingenuity and our tools, etc., professions became a huge crucible of innovation. And all sorts of innovations came out of civilizations, and again, many of the greatest blessings and evils of the human journey came out of the rise of civilization. And so back in the Fertile Crescent, inventing the wheel and the metallurgy, uh, cloud agriculture, there's all these things that came out of uh, civilization, plus, mass slavery and mass warfare and genocides. And I mean, genocide isn't but on a scale that hadn't been seen before. And just reading the rise and fall of agrarian civilizations was a very depressing exercise, actually, to see how they all have the same trajectory. In fact, the agrarian potentate who lived a long, peaceful reign and died of natural causes, that was highly unusual. Usually they died violently, usually at the hand of their like relatives, because everybody wanted that throne, and so yeah, it's just really grim, really grim. Sons slaughtering brothers, slaughtering each other, slaughtering their fathers, and the fathers slaughtering their sons and their brothers, and women got into the act once in a while. It was just, yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of inspiration from studying the rise and fall of these civilizations. Um, anyway, so. But one thing that did happen, this is kind of the reason for my epical framework, is that with each epoch, humans were able to get a bunch more energy, and each time was the orders of magnitude kind of more energy quite often. So again, when humans expanded in the second epoch 1,000 times, well, they consumed 1,000 times more energy than they did at the beginning, but it ended up being 1,000 times more people. And so, but what happened was that, like in hunter-gatherer societies, they figured that about a quarter of hunter-gatherer men died violently. In fact, in chimp societies, about half of chimps died violently, male chimps. And I've seen different numbers, but somewhere like 40 or 50% of male chimps died violently at the hands of their fellows. In fact, usually from the neighboring societies as they had warfare against each other. In fact, they had warfare tactics that are very similar to human tactics. Rear guard actions and night raids, surprise raids and this kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's depressingly familiar when you start those aspects of studying the past, the chimps and humans, etc. But what happened was that, only a quarter of the men died violently in hunter-gatherer societies, where more died violently in chimp societies. And then once you had agriculture, it went down even more, and so it kept declining. And so, in fact, there's Steven Pinker. He wrote a book about that. Steven Pinker, unfortunately, is an imperial apologist. It really underplays the United States atrocities. In fact, Ed Herman had a very scathing critique about his work, Pinker's work. But the Pinker was right about it is more peaceful than it used to be. Yeah, so the peaceful savage idea of Rousseau and stuff wasn't it really wasn't. Hobbes won that debate, So yeah, the human journey was pretty brutal. Nasty, brutish, and short lives was what most people lived until industrialization, really. And so and so while there was less proportional violence in agrarian societies, but when they did have wars, they were big blowouts. Millions of people would die, et cetera. So it was yeah, a mixed kind of thing where proportionally it was less violent, but when they really got killing, man, they really got killing. Mounds of skulls, building pyramids of skulls, the inhabitants of a city, putting out the city gates. That became a favored, way to deal with your neighbors. This kind of thing. Again, super barbaric stuff was going on. Again, which is it also isn't new. This is sort of hunter gathered. They all sorts of war trophies. The skull of your neighbor became a nice bowl, to drink out of, etc. The war trophies is common. Again, and some of that was to keep. There was a part of ancestor worship where you're trying to keep part of, your member in the tribe. So some of those um, mementos, let's say, and again, and soup bowls or whatever. Some of that may have been reverence of ancestors, but I think most of it was war trophies. And I think this is another area where there's all these people trying to downplay our violent past. And again, to me, it does a disservice in obscuring how far we really come. So where I live today, I live next to Microsoft, where everybody's affluent, and violence is unknown. In fact, the only violence that happens here is from the poor parts of Seattle that come here and commit crimes and rob rich people. But rich people don't rob each other. You're affluent, you don't. And this is one of the key aspects of my message ultimately is that if we live in a world of abundance, why would anybody steal from one another? Why would anybody commit crimes or be violent? All the reasons for that go away, which I will get to. Yeah, poverty and crime are companions, always have been. And so anyway, and then so after millennia, so what I call the third epoch lasted for 10,000 years or more before the rise to industrialization, and Europe did that. So Europe really began its rise. In fact, they marked the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's quite often the beginning of the 1700s when the first steam engines were built, new common, and then you also had they started smelting iron with coal on a commercial scale, and so and for me, that's sort of the marker of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is those two events, which happened in the first decade of the 1700s. But the rise to industrialization, it wasn't that abrupt, in my opinion. I mean, definitely exploding coal was a watershed event, but Europe had this, several centuries of increasing standards of living, et cetera, because they basically water mills. So this was invented by Greek engineers. Rome used it, and northwestern Europe, because of all the regular rainfall off the Atlantic, made it and the terrain, et cetera, made it just perfect for water mills. In fact, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, there were like 500,000 water mills in Europe. And then back in the Domesday Survey, back there in 1086 or whatever, there were already 10,000 water mills, like in France and in England, et cetera. And it was the first time that non-muscle power had been generated on land. And it was huge. In fact, it's been called the medieval industrial revolution. So there are lots of advances that happened back in the high Middle Ages, which is a warming period. That's one, again, back to energy. So yeah, the sort of energy runs all through this. And so, but you also have the Black Death again, the little ice age. So when the high Middle Ages are over, then it started cooling down again. You start having famines and pandemics and awesome wars, etc. and it became hell on earth in Europe back in the 1300s, etc. And but in Europe, not only the watermill was a huge one, the biggest innovation, which led to Europe's conquest of the world, was the technical achievement of turning Earth's ocean into a low energy transportation lane. Just like I said, the early civilizations were located on, water, bodies of water on a shoreline. When Europe learned how to sail the high seas, easily conquered the world, particularly, the Americas, Australia, these people who were nowhere near the level of economic development, they didn't have a chance. They were just totally wiped out. So, in fact, Europe's conquest of the world was a catastrophe for the world's people. Uh, yeah, the Western Hemisphere, the population of the first century and a half of the Spanish or European conquests, particularly the Spanish, um, the population of the Western Hemisphere declined by between 75 and 95%. And that's the greatest demographic catastrophe in the human journey, particularly for a couple of continents. And Africa suffered, because you had the slave trade, et cetera. The transatlantic, you always had slavery was as old as civilization, and older, as old as sedentary societies. And again, actually stealing women from neighboring societies that the hunter-gatherers did, that was to me, that was kind of the roots of slavery, involuntary servitude, and so then it really expanded with the rise of civilization. And in fact, the first laws, in writing. So when writing was developed in Sumer, et cetera, and you eventually had the Code of Hammurabi, et cetera, you read these first laws, and like, a third of the laws are about how to treat slaves. Slaves were such a normal part of life back then. And so, anyway, and it made economic sense, and so in a hunter-gatherer bands, slavery didn't have, there was no economic, other than stealing women, having a slave didn't make a lot of sense economically. How do you feed them, et cetera? How do you keep them? But once humans became sedentary, then slavery started making sense. Because it takes a lot of energy to raise a human, so why raise people when you just steal them from your neighboring societies? And so this was, yeah, economics drove so many of these things. And so, anyway, Europe conquered the world, and during the midst of that conquest, deforested England eventually turned to coal and industrialized off of that, and became the first nation to industrialize. And it allowed them to become the first global empire. In fact, the United States is really the second global empire, but we pretend we're not one. And so, and my point though is that, and I don't want to repeat myself too much here, but the energy practices were the foundation for each epoch, as an energy source. So a new energy source was exploited and unfortunately plundered to exhaustion every time. Okay. And from the megafauna to the soils to the forests and now fossil fuels, you keep just, use up one energy source and move on to the next one. And not sustainable, right? And so, but what's happened is that we're, again, an industrial world is much more humane and less violent because energy powered machines is really the industrial revolution. So every American, I live at the, I get the benefit of effectively several hundred people every day waiting on me hand and foot, which no potentate, was really able to have long ago. And so this is because of energy powered machines. And so this is yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, I consume about 100 times the calories that go into my diet, which again, we use far vastly more energy. In fact, when England industrialized, the numbers are just extraordinary. In 3 centuries, England's energy consumption rose by a factor of 30, I believe. It was just awesome numbers. And so the English people consume far more energy than any people ever had. I mean, by a lot. And so, and that's industrialization. That's what led to the rising standards of living. In fact, the biggest side effect of all of that was the end of childhood death. This going all the way back to gorillas. Half of the offspring died before they reached reproductive age, or called adulthood. Half of them died, and up until 300 years ago, all the way back to gorillas, half the children died. And so anyway, and that happened because of industrialization. But it had nothing to do with medical interventions. It was improvements in sanitation, nutrition, and hygiene, which came from, again, industrialization. And so today, no children die, or very few. It's like in Iceland, like one out of every 300 children or 1,000 children or something dies for adulthood. It's a very small number. And anyway, except the United States, actually, our infant mortality rate is like 3 times Japan's, et cetera. Yeah, we're actually, the United States is kind of bringing up the rear on a lot of those kind of measures in industrial nations, which is something that, in fact, that's what Kennedy's trying to remedy right now with his, make America healthy and stuff. Um, but over each epoch, the surplus grew. Humanity's tools became more sophisticated. Our collective intelligence went up. Writing was a huge boon to that. We actually had now artifacts that we could sort of offload our brains to, our memories to, et cetera. And then, of course, we have the internet, all this kind of stuff. So humanity's collective intelligence has skyrocketed, and our collective technological ability has skyrocketed. And in fact, as you know, you've been watching my work, is that the people who run the world have technologies that Star Trek. We have Star Trek level technologies on the planet, but they are hoarding them and making sure that we don't enjoy them so they can keep ruling the world. And we're gonna make it or not on that. That's the issue. The crux of humanity's future is whether we can overcome that or not, which is what my work's all about. And so on, but over each epoch, though, humanities, as the tools became more sophisticated, energy surplus grew, society became more humane, less violent. To where today, where I live, violence is unknown. Particularly amongst the affluent people. Yeah, violence it's obsolete because people don't live in scarcity. And so, anyway, I'm looking through my summary here, and yeah, so elites, they understand that if you had a world of abundance, that elites would go away. They wouldn't, the whole concept of elites would disappear if you had abundance. If everybody, because elites have always been economic elites above all else, and conspicuous consumption was always the mark of their status. And this is, since the first civilization, it's always been this way. And so, anyway, that'll all end. And they know this. So the global elites are very well aware that the world will end as we know it if there's a world of abundance. And so we live in an era of artificially induced scarcity. So elites can keep playing their power games, the global elites can. And so, as I mentioned in my interview yesterday, or my video yesterday, the Kennedy assassination, the American presidents are way down the hierarchy of power on earth. Tackling Washington, D.C., et cetera, it's not going to solve our existential risks. It's again, it's yeah, that's not where the power is. And it's this thing where there's a kind of power there, but the existential issues we face are not going to be solved through political processes, et cetera. That's my opinion. Oh, after my crazy journey and trading notes with my fellow travelers, the ones who survived the experience long enough so we could trade notes. And so anyway, so again, and I will get into this in my future videos, but in fact, my next video I think will be what I call the fifth epoch can look like. So the Industrial Revolution began what I call the fourth epoch, which was based on fossil fuels. And the fifth epoch will be based on free energy technology. And I don't think we can get there with the tools of the fourth epoch of capitalism and all this kind of stuff. I think it has to be enough people have to muster enough integrity and sentience to pursue what I've called love and enlightenment path towards free energy. And it wouldn't take very many of us. And as I mentioned in my interview with these Green Party activists last summer, the greatest triumph of the global elite is making the fifth epoch, this world I'm arguing for, which is based on abundance and love, to make that world unimaginable, impossible, all this kind of stuff. And when people are there where they think it's unimaginable and impossible, the elites win. I mean, their job's done. We'll be sitting there, gnawing at our scarcity-based bones trying to survive. And so, anyway, yeah, it wouldn't take very many of us to make that happen. And and I'm here. That's what I'm here for, is to make that happen. But anyway, this has been a rather long discussion. I think I'm done for now. So bye for now.